But we're actually going to look at the text and look at some of the words that we would find at the very beginning and do a little bit of a close reading of what might be going on there. So as I spoke about last night, it is an awkward and difficult thing to come to Shabbat at this moment in our community. This past week has been very heavy. And each moment felt like, yet again, something else was oppressing us, was requiring us to find resilience and understanding and compassion and hope when the external was just so sad. Between our pandemic and the shooting that happened earlier this week and the wildfires from the last 2 days, it has been very difficult to imagine what does it mean to come to Shabbat, and how do we even incorporate and assimilate this idea of rest and peace in a moment where just saying those two words out loud can feel like an affront to what we see swirling around us. So during this week and its waves of frustration, as often happens when we encounter tragedy and multiple tragedies, I felt many ways. There was not just one emotion in response. Anger, sadness, exhaustion, defeat, frustration. And oftentimes, it was just too much to keep all of that inside. I couldn't just ruminate on all of the emotions I was feeling. I had to actually verbalize some of it out loud, just to express the waves of what was happening. And as may be true for many of you, there were therefore many different sounds that came out of me at any given moment this week. Sounds of frustration, of sadness, of anger, each having their own quality, even if they were not associated with actual words. Just sounds. And so it was very striking for me to read the beginning of this week's Torah portion, where our ancestors, the Israelites, are still in slavery. And in Exodus chapter 6, verse 5, at the very beginning, it says in God's mouth, God is saying this out loud, V'gam ani shemati et na'akat b'nei Yisrael asher Mitzrayim ma'avadim otam va'ezkor et briti. I have now heard, God says, the moaning of the Israelites, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. A sound. That is what the beginning of our Torah portion attributes to God's shift and turn. I have heard the moaning. There are no words ascribed to the Israelites here. No actual verbiage of any kind. Just na'akat, a groaning, a moaning. And as I'm reading that, I thought to myself, that doesn't seem like enough for what the Israelites were going through. If I myself, just this week in 4 days, went through a whole range of emotions, and this is slavery for hundreds of years, multiple generations, how could simply na'akat, a groaning sound, express what they were going through? And so I looked back at last week's Torah portion. And sure enough, in the very beginning of last week's Torah portion, in the 2 verses that become the set induction for everything else that gets played out in Exodus, there's a little bit more. And in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, it says, Vayehi bayamim harabim hahem, after many years, a long time after that, Vayamot melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died. Vaye'anchu v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage. Vayiz'aku, and they cried out. Vata'al shavatam el ha'elohim min ha'avodah, and their cry for help rose up to God. Vayishma Elohim et na'akatam, and God heard their moaning. Vayizkor Elohim et brito et Avraham et Yitzchak ve'et Yaakov. And God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 4 words we get in these 2 verses for what the Israelites were trying to express. Vaye'anchu, they were sighing and groaning from physical distress, from pain, from actual physical pain. Vayiz'aku, number 2, they shouted out, they cried out, which often can imply za'ak, that verb, which is actually a little bit onomatopoetic if you say it very strongly. Za'ak, anxiety, alarm, distress, and sorrow. Shavatam, or shav'ah, which is the verb of that word, which is a cry for help. Specifically, a cry for help. And na'akatam, which is the word from our Torah portion also today, a groaning from oppression. 4 different ways to express and experience the depth of the frustration and the sadness and the anger, right? 4 different ways. And that felt a little better to me. That in the experience of what the Israelites were going through, there was a multiplicity of emotion and a multiplicity of sound related to that emotion. And I think that speaks to what many of us might be feeling right now. It's not enough to be angry about what we saw this past week and what we continue to be asked to hold and go through. And it's not enough to just be sad. And it's not enough to just be depressed. And it's not enough to just be frustrated. We are all of those things at the same time. And therefore, sometimes we are also exhausted and empty. And as I was trying to assimilate all of these different feelings inside, I thought back to a part of our tradition that has assigned particular texts, particular psalms from our Tanakh, from our Jewish Bible, to use in times of community sadness. So many times has our Jewish community experienced communal tragedy, that there are actual pieces of liturgy that the Talmud says, when your community is in distress, say this. And it becomes a marker of how we as a community recognize together that we are in a moment of sadness and distress. Now, one of those psalms is Psalm 130. And in Psalm 130, we start by saying, Mima'amakim keraticha Adonai. Out of the depths, out of the deepest, darkest hole, I call to you, God. And that first line feels very gratifying, because that, to me, feels like we are taking all of these other cries, all of these other feelings, all of these other words that we've used historically, and letting them fall into this deep pit of frustration and despair where it is pulling us down, and saying, from that place, God, of just downness, of just at the bottom, I am calling out to you. But here's what's interesting about Psalm 130. is that as a piece of text specifically allocated to express community outrage and tragedy, none of those other words that I shared with you exist in that psalm. What Psalm 130 says is, Mima'amakim keraticha Adonai, from the bottom I call to you. Shim'a bekoli, hear my voice, God. Tihyena oznecha kashuvot lekol tachnunai. Let your ears, God, be attentive to my plea. That's it. The rest of the psalm we'll get to in a second, but that's the beginning. Just those words. I call to you. I cry to you. I plea to you. I might have imagined that a psalm marked out for community tragedy would be angrier or full of more of the different emotions. But what Psalm 130 does at the very beginning is it distills all of that emotion into the simplest, most basic sound. I'm calling to you, God. There is so much underneath it all, but I'm calling out. I'm crying to you, and I'm asking you, I am pleading with you to listen to me. It brings it back to the relationship. Because while at the very beginning and throughout this week, it was all I could do to yell one way, just yelling out. Psalm 130 reminds us that we are actually, in times of tragedy, asking for relationship back, asking for strength back, inner strength back to help us walk through this. Help us move from the bottom, from those deepest, darkest depths, back up into the world that needs our help, into the walk that our fellow congregants, community members need us to do. So I'm going to read a fuller translation of Psalm 130. It is a poetic translation. It's not quite a literal translation. But I think what I find compelling about this text is that it takes all of this emotion from the beginning of Exodus and what we are feeling in our deepest, darkest moments and when we encounter community tragedy, and it tries to bring it together in a way that we can actually hold it and not splinter into 1,000 pieces. Psalm 130. I am drowning deep in myself, Adonai. I'm crying. I'm calling you. Hear this voice, Adonai. Find me in your ears, the mercy of your attention. Allow a song coming through us to you as I call to you, as I rely on these words, as I wait for you, more certain than dawn, though the steady ticking till morning. Wait, Israel. Even when time seems to stop, Adonai comes to me in a rush of love, setting my heart free into a bright sky, and we are lightened in the mercy of God's attention. Shabbat Shalom. We are going to take a moment now with all of that in our minds and in our hearts. We are going to say a prayer for those in our community who are in need of healing. And there are just so many right now who need our strength and our comfort and our attention and our hope. And so we turn to these words from Psalm 126, which hope desperately that those who sow in tears will reap in joy. And as we always do, in between the verses of this prayer, we will ask for names of people that you know and of people that you imagine need us and need our spiritual presence at this moment. Those who sow in tears will reap in joy, will reap in joy. Those who sow in tears will reap in joy. On this Shabbat, we pray for healing for everyone suffering from this wave of the pandemic. We pray for the victims of the shooting in Denver this past week. We pray for all of those who lost in the recent wildfires, who are losing their homes, who were injured in the fire. We pray for our community to have the strength to continue to support and sustain those who need us, and these congregants, loved ones, and friends. Baruch atah Adonai, makor harefua. Blessed are you, Adonai, source of healing. It's the song of the dreamer. From a dark place it grows, like a flower in the desert, the oasis of our souls. Come back where you belong. You hear our longing cries. Our words, our lips are filled with song. You can see our tear-filled eyes. Those who sow in tears will reap in joy, will reap in joy. Those who sow in tears will reap in joy, will reap in joy. We rise as we are able for Aleinu. Aleinu leshabeach ladon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הרצון, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'namar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. You may be seated.